From the moment the doors opened and the world heard the words Mr. and Mrs. Gosling for the first time, something about that moment felt bigger than a wedding announcement. It wasn't just a title change or a ceremonial introduction. It was the beginning of a new chapter for two people who had walked through very different lives, learned from past mistakes, carried their own bruises, and somehow ended up finding a love that felt both grounding and electrifying at the same time. The cameras caught their smiles, but behind those smiles was a story that took years to build, full of surprises, quiet moments, emotional breakthroughs, and decisions that changed both of them in ways they never expected. Stephanie's reaction said it all. Hearing her name as the new Mrs. Gosling didn't just make her beam, it made her pause. It felt surreal, like a moment she'd stepped into from someone else's life. She laughed at herself, almost not believing the words were real. Jon, of course, couldn't resist teasing her, claiming he had been thinking it long before she had. Their playfulness wasn't forced, and it didn't feel like a couple trying to show off. It was natural, a genuine, lived-in connection between two people who acted less like newlyweds and more like lifelong best friends. Even as they stood there, soaking it all in, they admitted the reality hadn't fully hit them. Maybe it was because they'd always felt married in the ways that mattered. They already lived together, built routines together, and finished each other's sentences without thinking. For Jon, he couldn't wait to start dropping the word wife into every conversation. Stephanie joked she'd be calling him husband nonstop until he begged her to stop. It was soft, funny, and real, and it hinted at something much deeper beneath the surface. Jon remembers exactly when everything clicked for him 3 years ago, long before wedding plans, guest lists, and emotional vows. They took a trip to Miami. It wasn't the destination that mattered. It was the way she fit into every moment of his life there. She didn't need guidance, pushing, or explanations. She didn't treat his world like something she had to learn or impress him with. She moved through it naturally, as if she'd always belonged there. For the first time, he realized he didn't have to play a role or lead someone through the chaos of his public life. With her, he could just be himself. No pressure, no pretending, just comfort. And somewhere in that comfort, he realized she wasn't just someone he loved. She was his best friend. But Stephanie had known earlier than he realized. For her, it was the feeling of being free. Free to laugh, free to be goofy, free to be the truest version of herself without judgment. She could be vulnerable and still feel safe. Their laughter became the core of their relationship. It wasn't polished or controlled. It was the kind of laughter that came from inside, the kind that made even the hardest days easier. That feeling, the instant lightness she had around him, was what made her fall in love almost immediately. That connection, the effortless, joyful, everyday bond, became the foundation for something much bigger. The moment Jon decided to propose. He wanted to do it the old-fashioned way, not the modern, flashy proposals that go viral online, not a stunt or a spectacle. He wanted something traditional, respectful, and deeply meaningful. Stephanie values family more than anything, especially her father. So Jon quietly went to him first. He didn't tell Stephanie, he didn't hint, he didn't even act differently. He handled it privately, respectfully, and with intention, knowing how much it would mean to her. After getting her father's blessing, he set up the perfect cover story, a supposed early Thanksgiving dinner, pitched as a simple family gathering because they might not see each other during the holiday. Stephanie walked in thinking nothing of it, just a family meal. She had no idea what was coming. Surrounded by both of their families, she saw Jon drop to one knee, and without hesitation, she said yes. No dramatic pause, no confusion, no overthinking, just a pure, instinctive answer. And that answer changed everything. And as beautiful as that proposal was, nothing compared to the moment they stood face to face preparing to read their vows. Stephanie had always imagined vows that reflected their real personalities, emotional but playful, heartfelt but filled with humor. She loved the idea of open vows because it allowed them to speak from the heart. Jon, on the other hand, wanted to express himself perfectly, but writing wasn't exactly his specialty. So he did what so many people secretly do. He used ChatGPT as a starting point, not to write the vows for him, but to help him shape his thoughts. He wrote down everything he loved about her, everything he admired, everything he felt but couldn't articulate. Then he let the AI organize his words, and afterward he rewrote them again, adjusting them until they sounded like him. It wasn't cheating, it was a man trying to get it right. But when he stood there at the altar, even with his vows perfectly prepared, he wasn't ready for what came next. He had promised his friends, tough, macho guys, his groomsmen, that he wouldn't cry. He told himself he'd be strong, composed, in control. But the moment he saw Stephanie walking toward him, his chest tightened, his eyes burned. All that determination disappeared instantly. He tried to hold it together, breathing deeply, telling himself to stay strong. For a moment he managed, until he reached the part of his vows about Juliana, Stephanie's daughter. That was the moment everything broke. He spoke about loving her as his own, about wanting to protect her and be a father figure she could rely on. As soon as those words left his mouth, he couldn't stop the emotion. His voice cracked, his eyes filled, and there was no hiding it. And Stephanie, who didn't expect him to include her daughter so deeply in his vows, felt her heart stop. It meant everything. It showed her not just the man she married, but the father he was choosing to become. That one moment said more than any vows could. But that emotion didn't come out of nowhere. It was rooted in his past, his mistakes, his regrets, and the lessons that shaped him long before Stephanie ever walked into his life. Jon doesn't hide the fact that he's made mistakes. He's lived much of his adulthood in the public eye, and that kind of scrutiny forces someone to grow up quickly. The world watched him stumble, succeed, fail, and rebuild. He often felt like he didn't have the freedom to process things privately. He learned the hard way how people shift, how relationships change, and how easily trust can break. After his divorce, he shut down emotionally. He became guarded, strict, and unwilling to let anyone in. He describes himself back then as black and white, no in between, no softness, no patience. It wasn't because he didn't care. It was because caring had cost him before. It felt safer to close the door than to risk opening it again. But Stephanie changed that without even trying. With her, he learned patience again. He learned sympathy again. He learned how to be gentle not just with her, but with himself and with his children. She softened the parts of him he thought were permanently hardened. She reminded him that not every relationship has to be a battle or a performance. Sometimes love can be calm, steady, and kind. Stephanie, on the other hand, didn't feel like she changed. She felt like she finally became who she was always meant to be. She had spent years keeping her guard up, trusting only a small circle of family, never allowing herself to be vulnerable with the world. Jon became the first person outside of her immediate family who made her feel safe enough to open up. He didn't reshape her, he unlocked parts of her she had kept hidden. Together, they built something rare, a love rooted in friendship, camaraderie, respect, and shared values. They agree on family, loyalty, morals, and the importance of building a stable, supportive home. They learned how to move as a team before becoming a couple. Their partnership wasn't rushed or forced. It grew naturally, step by step, until there was nothing left to question. By the time the world saw them as Mr. and Mrs. Gosling, the truth was simple. They had already been partners long before the wedding. The ceremony only made it official. And that's what makes their story powerful. It wasn't a whirlwind romance or a dramatic fairy tale. It was two people who learned, grew, healed, and chose each other every single day until love became the easiest decision of their lives. Their wedding didn't mark the beginning, it marked the moment the world finally caught up to what they had known all along. Real love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it builds slowly, in laughter, in trust, in late night conversations, in small acts of kindness. Sometimes it appears when you least expect it, in the middle of a life you thought you had already figured out. Jon and Stephanie found that kind of love, steady, healing, transformative. A love shaped not by perfection, but by truth. And that is what makes their story unforgettable.